For more on the power on scientific language, listen back to the episode on mental health. So let's combine these two things. On the one hand, we have pre-existing concerns about the physical health of the British population thrown into sharp relief by the Second Boer War. On the other hand, we have this new movement of eugenics, which is coating this prejudice against foreign bodies with the illusion of scientific rigor. Both of these things are combining to frame incoming foreigners as not just foreign, but as fundamentally dangerous to the existence of the native population. In fact, the Eugenics Education Society of Britain, founded in 1907, would explicitly study the alleged health impacts on the British public of Jewish migrant populations of London's East End for at least 2 decades following the passage of the 1905 Aliens Act. There's also a third factor, which is really accentuating these concerns about the immigration of Eastern European Jews, and that is British emigration. So the outward flow of people from Britain. Emigration was actively encouraged as part of imperialism because one of the key logics that underpins imperialism is this belief in the supremacy of imperial power, this belief that the imperial power knows best, meaning that the imperial power had not even a right but a duty to govern over foreign populations through the imperial structure. And who better to run that imperial structure but the British people? So, emigration had long since been actively encouraged as part of Britain's colonising mission. But in the context of fears about immigration, emigration poses an even more substantial threat because it's not even just that, the bad stock is arriving, but there's also less of the quote-unquote good stock present in the country to dilute this effect. And this is the logic that informs Leonard Darwin's comments in 1919, Leonard being the son of famed geneticist Charles Darwin, when he says, "Immigration and emigration certainly stand first for consideration amongst imperial problems, for we all see the importance of keeping up the quality of human marble which we are constantly exporting, and of seeing that this export does not reduce the quality of human stone, which will have to be used in future for the building of our own nation." So essentially he's saying, we should be exporting our best people, our human marble, to ensure that we can resolve imperial problems. But we shouldn't export so many of them that we can't produce new best people. We should make sure that our stock or quality of human stone is sufficient to replenish reserves. So pretty big yikes to that. But that's the history and context of Britain's first immigration law. These three factors, public health concerns, the rise of eugenic population thinking, and concerns about British emigration linked to British imperialism, are combining to frame inward migration as an existential threat to the British population, leading to the passage of the 1905 Aliens Act. Now, I'm going to jump forward a couple of decades to the period just after World War II. There were a few more immigration laws passed in the interim that we could talk about, but in the interest of not having this be 3 hours long, I'm just going to skip ahead to the good stuff. So before I get started on what was happening with borders and migration in the post-war era, I just want to set the scene a little bit with what was happening in the UK generally immediately after World War II. Now, again, there are 3 phenomena that I want to point to as really affecting the whole development of the migration system. The first is the loss of imperial power. So Britain throughout not just the Second World War, but also the First World War had this very bad habit of promising various people in colonized territories that they would have either full-blown independence or at least more control over the territory if they fought for the side of the British during said war. So this, for example, is how the state of Saudi Arabia is created. So Britain during World War I is fighting the Ottoman Empire, who at that time were the colonizing power in what was then known as the Arabian Peninsula, which was later, over the course of the 20th century, split into the states of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, the UAE, and parts of Iraq and Jordan. So Britain's aim during World War I was to turn some of the natives in this area against the Ottomans. And to do so, the state started offering various groups control over their respective territories if they fought for the side of the British in the war. In the territory that would later become Saudi Arabia, the British specifically backed two guys who had been in direct competition for power over the peninsula for some time, in the hopes that, I guess, both would first fight the Ottomans for the British, but later would resume their power struggle and probably kill each other off, meaning that Britain would not have to fulfill its promise to hand over territorial control to either party. It's this real, playing both sides, divide and conquer approach to foreign policy strategy that has been very typical of British imperialism. So one guy was a guy called Hussein bin Ali, and the other guy was a guy called Ibn Saud. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Middle Eastern history, you'll know that Ibn Saud eventually wins and does become the first king of the newly founded state of Saudi Arabia, but he only does so after leading another reign of terror against his opponents, estimated to have killed 400,000 people and mutilated at least 350,000 others, and also installing a religious regime based on the ultra-conservative branch of Islam called Wahhabism, which incidentally is the ideological mantle that would later be taken up by ISIS in the 21st century. So really just a 10 out of 10 outcome there for British policy. Well done, guys. What a literal slay. But yeah, this tactic is pretty much British imperialism 101. Basically, they'll just go in and promise competing factions to the world in order to get what they want, whilst sowing as much chaos and division into a territory as possible, so that the people of that territory won't be able to effectively unite enough to oppose British imperial rule once Britain has achieved its desired outcome. By the end of World War II, this approach to foreign policy is no longer such a tenable option for the British state. Essentially, the resource and manpower cost of fighting in two global wars had left the UK significantly drained and less able to fend off independence movements. Even further, many other colonizing nations, particularly in North America, were not so badly affected by the world wars. So the balance of global power was shifting in a huge way. So it's not just that British power is decreasing in absolute terms. Perhaps even more importantly, it's that it's decreasing in relative terms. And this context means that when Canada, a former British colony, passes its first Nationality Act in 1946, meaning in effect that the Canadian people would no longer be classed as British subjects, but as this new category of Canadian citizens, Britain totally fucking shits itself. So this leads the British political establishment to do something that they would later very much regret and pass a bill called the British Nationality Act in 1948.